When you close your eyes and picture the quintessential American heavy bomber of the Second World War, a very specific image almost certainly comes to mind. You see a sleek, silver or olive drab aircraft with a massive tail, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns, flying through a sky blackened by German flak. You picture the Memphis Belle. You think of Hollywood movies, and you hear the name Flying Fortress. The Boeing B-17 is etched into the American cultural consciousness as the weapon that broke the back of the Axis powers. But what if I told you that the true workhorse of the United States Army Air Forces, the bomber that actually flew more missions, dropped more tons of high explosives, boasted a longer range, flew at a higher top speed, and was produced in greater numbers than any other American military aircraft in history, is practically a footnote in our popular culture? Today we are tearing down the mythology and examining the brutal, unglamorous and ruthlessly efficient reality of the Consolidated B-24 Liberator. This was not a flying movie star. This was a flying boxcar, a blue-collar brawler of the skies that did the heavy lifting from the freezing altitudes over Germany to the sweltering, vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean. Welcome back to the channel. If you appreciate no-nonsense military history, deep-dive tactical analysis, and the cold, hard facts behind the weapons that shaped our world, hit that subscribe button right now. And I want you to let me know down in the comments, why do you think Hollywood and the history books have so thoroughly ignored the B-24 in favor of the B-17? Let us get into the strategic roots of this forgotten behemoth. To understand why the B-24 exists, we have to rewind the clock long before the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, back to the dusty airfields and drafting rooms of the 1920s and 30s. After the First World War, American military aviation was in a state of existential crisis. The airplane had proven its worth as a scout and a tactical fighter over the trenches of France, but visionary thinkers like General Billy Mitchell believed that air power was not just a supporting arm for the infantry. Mitchell and his disciples, who would later become known as the Bomber Mafia at the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field in Alabama, developed a radical new doctrine. They believed that the next major war would not be won by millions of men dying in muddy trenches. Instead, it would be won by fleets of heavy bombers flying high above the battlefield, bypassing the enemy armies entirely to strike directly at the industrial heart of the enemy nation. This was the doctrine of unescorted, high-altitude, daylight precision bombing. The logic was cold and mathematical. If you destroy the factories making the ball bearings, the oil refineries producing the aviation fuel, and the rail yards transporting the ammunition, the enemy army on the front lines will eventually starve and collapse. It was the 20th century equivalent of the Union Army's Anaconda Plan during the American Civil War, designed to strangle the Confederacy's capacity to wage war. But this time, the strangulation would come from the stratosphere. But there was a massive gap between this ambitious doctrine and the actual hardware sitting on American tarmacs. In the mid-1930s, the United States was a deeply isolationist country. The military budget was practically non-existent, starved by the Great Depression, and a public that wanted absolutely nothing to do with another European bloodbath. The Army Air Corps was flying obsolete biplanes and twin-engine bombers that lacked the range to cross the Atlantic, let alone project power across the globe. The introduction of the Boeing B-17 in 1935 seemed like a godsend to the bomber mafia. It was a four-engine marvel that proved a heavy bomber could fly fast and carry a significant payload. However, by 1938, as the geopolitical situation in Europe began to rapidly deteriorate, with Nazi Germany annexing its neighbors, the leadership of the Army Air Corps realized a terrifying truth. The B-17, as groundbreaking as it was not going to be enough. They needed more bombers, and they needed them fast. Furthermore, looking at the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean, where a potential conflict with the Empire of Japan was brewing, the B-17's range was considered marginal at best. The military needed a bomber that could fly further, carry a heavier bomb load, and be mass-produced on a scale never before seen in human history. In January of 1939, the Chief of the Army Air Corps, Major General Henry Hap Arnold, summoned the President of the Consolidated Aircraft Corporation, Reuben Fleet, to Washington. Consolidated, based in San Diego, California, was famous for building massive long-range flying boats for the Navy, like the PBY Catalina. Arnold had a simple, desperate request. He wanted Consolidated to expand its factory and start building Boeing B-17s under license to help meet the surging demand. This is where military history hinges on the ego and brilliance of one man. Reuben Fleet looked at the blueprints for the B-17, looked at the general, and flatly refused. He told Arnold that the B-17 was already an aging design, and that Consolidated could design and build a completely new bomber from scratch that would utterly outclass the Flying Fortress in speed, range, and payload. It was an incredibly arrogant gamble. Fleet was promising to design a world-beating 4-engine heavy bomber in a matter of months, a process that normally took years. Why would the Army Air Corps, already heavily invested in the proven B-17 and operating on a shoestring budget, risk its meager resources on a radical, untested design from a company that had never built a heavy land-based bomber? The answer lies in a piece of aerodynamic black magic known as the Davis wing. A few years prior, a freelance aeronautical engineer named David Davis had approached Consolidated with a revolutionary wing design. Traditional aircraft wings of the era were thick and wide, providing plenty of lift but generating massive amounts of aerodynamic drag. Davis had used complex mathematical formulas to design a wing with a very high aspect ratio. This meant the wing was incredibly long and skinny, resembling the wing of a glider more than a heavy bomber. Furthermore, the cross-section of the wing was shaped like a teardrop, thick near the leading edge and tapering sharply. This specific geometry was designed to promote laminar flow, keeping the air moving smoothly over the surface of the wing for as long as possible before it broke up into turbulent drag. When Consolidated tested a model of the Davis wing in the wind tunnel at the California Institute of Technology, the results were so staggering that the engineers thought the wind tunnel was broken. The wing produced 20% less drag at cruising speeds than any conventional wing in existence. It was the aerodynamic equivalent of discovering a cheat code for fuel efficiency and lift. Reuben Fleet knew that if he bolted 4 powerful engines to this magical wing, he would have a bomber that could fly circles around the B-17. General Arnold, desperate for a strategic edge, took the bet. He gave Consolidated a contract for a prototype, designating it the XB-24, with the stipulation that the prototype had to be ready before the end of the year. The engineering team at Consolidated worked at a fever pitch, treating the project like a wartime emergency, even though the United States was technically still at peace. To save time, they essentially took the twin-tail assembly from their existing Model 31 flying boat and grafted it onto a massive slab-sided fuselage. While the B-17 was designed with graceful, sweeping curves, the B-24 was designed with a T-square. The fuselage was essentially a massive rectangular box designed to hold as many bombs and as much fuel as physically possible. This gave the aircraft its distinct, ungainly appearance, earning it nicknames like the Flying Boxcar or the Mack Truck of the Air. But in warfare, aesthetics mean absolutely nothing. Function dictates form, and the B-24 was a masterpiece of lethal functionality. The massive slab sides allowed for a cavernous bomb bay that was actually split down the middle by a central catwalk. This catwalk became the structural spine of the aircraft, connecting the flight deck in the front to the waist gunner positions in the rear. It was a terrifyingly narrow aluminum beam, only 9 inches wide, suspended over the bomb bay doors. In combat, crewmen would have to shuffle across this catwalk without parachutes, over open air at 20,000 feet, to manually unjam bombs or transfer ammunition. Let us dive deep into the technical specifications that made this flying boxcar such a devastating weapon. The heart of the B-24 consisted of 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp engines. These were 14-cylinder, 2-row radial engines, mechanical beasts that displaced exactly 1,830 cubic inches. Each engine churned out 1,200 horsepower at takeoff. But producing horsepower at sea level is easy. The challenge of the bomber mafia's doctrine was flying at 25 to 30,000 feet, where the air is so thin that a normal engine would suffocate and stall. To solve this, each engine was mated to a General Electric Type B turbo supercharger. These devices used the searing hot exhaust gases from the engine to spin a turbine at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute, which in turn drove a compressor that force-fed dense, pressurized air back into the carburetor. This complex, heavy, and incredibly dangerous plumbing system allowed the B-24 to maintain its full 1,200 horsepower all the way up into the freezing stratosphere. The engineering tolerance required to build turbo superchargers that would not melt or explode under these conditions was a triumph of American metallurgy, directly comparable to the technological leaps we see in modern stealth fighter jet engines today. The combination of the low-drag Davis wing and the turbo-supercharged twin Wasp engines gave the B-24 exceptional performance metrics. It had a maximum speed of 290 miles per hour, compared to the B-17's 287. While that seems like a negligible difference, the real gap was in range and payload. The B-17G could carry a typical bomb load of 4,000 pounds over a combat radius of about 800 miles. The B-24J could carry an astonishing 8,000 pounds of bombs over a radius of 1,000 miles. If you reduce the bomb load to a still respectable 5,000 pounds, the Liberator could reach out and strike targets up to 2,100 miles away. This massive discrepancy in range is exactly why the B-24 became the absolute king of the Pacific theater, where bases were separated by thousands of miles of empty, unforgiving ocean. In the Pacific, running out of fuel did not mean a rough landing in a French farmer's field. It meant disappearing forever beneath the waves. The Liberator's long legs were quite literally the difference between life and death for its crews, and the difference between victory and defeat for the strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese Empire. Another revolutionary feature of the B-24, which often goes unnoticed but fundamentally changed how the aircraft operated, was its landing gear. The B-17, like almost all heavy aircraft of the 1930s, was a tail-dragger. It had 2 main wheels in the front and a small wheel under the tail, meaning the nose pointed up into the sky when sitting on the ground. This made taxiing a nightmare, as the pilots could not see directly in front of them, and it made taking off and landing incredibly tricky, prone to a deadly phenomenon called a ground loop. where the tail tries to overtake the nose. The B-24, however, utilized a modern tricycle landing gear arrangement, with a nose wheel and two main gear legs under the wings. This meant the aircraft sat perfectly level on the tarmac. This seemingly simple change had profound logistical and operational impacts. First, it made the aircraft much easier to taxi, take off, and land, allowing less experienced pilots to handle the massive bomber safely. Second, a level fuselage meant that armorers could load bombs and mechanics could service the engines much more efficiently, drastically reducing turnaround times between missions. When you are fighting a global war of attrition, shaving 30 minutes off the time it takes to arm a bomber translates directly into more sorties, more bombs on target, and a faster collapse of the enemy's industrial base. Even the bomb bay doors of the B-24 were a radical departure from convention. Traditional bombers used large, heavy clamshell doors that swung downward into the slipstream. When opened at 200 miles per hour, these massive doors acted like giant air brakes, causing violent buffeting, slowing the aircraft down, and making it an easier target for anti-aircraft fire right at the most critical moment of the bombing run. The engineers at Consolidated solved this by designing roller-blind bomb bay doors. These doors were made of corrugated metal and rolled up the sides of the fuselage on tracks, much like a modern garage door. This meant that when the bombardier opened the doors to drop his payload, the aerodynamic profile of the aircraft did not change one bit. The B-24 maintained its speed and stability, providing a rock-solid platform for the highly classified Norden bomb site. This analog mechanical computer, which the military claimed could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet, required an incredibly stable aircraft to calculate the complex variables of wind speed, altitude, and drift. The B-24's roller-blind doors and high wing loading made it a superior bombing platform in turbulent skies. But designing a brilliant bomber on paper is only 10% of the battle. The true genius of the American war machine was not just in its engineering, but in its unparalleled capacity for mass production. By 1941, as the British were desperately fighting off the Luftwaffe during the Blitz and begging for American heavy bombers, the United States government realized that Consolidated's factory in San Diego, though efficient, could never produce enough B-24s to meet the looming global demand. The military needed thousands of these bombers, and they needed them immediately. How do you take an aircraft that consists of over 450,000 individual parts, held together by 360,000 rivets, and build it at a rate that defies human comprehension? You do not ask an aircraft company. You ask a car company. You ask the man who invented the moving assembly line. You ask Henry Ford. In what would become one of the most staggering industrial achievements in human history, the United States government contracted the Ford Motor Company to build a massive, purpose-built factory specifically to mass-produce the B-24 Liberator. Ford's production genius, Charles Sorensen, took one look at Consolidated's traditional method of building airplanes, which involved highly skilled craftsmen custom-fitting parts by hand, and threw it out the window. Sorensen envisioned an automotive-style assembly line, but scaled up to accommodate a 30-ton, 4-engine bomber. The result was the Willow Run bomber plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan. This was not just a factory, it was an industrial leviathan. The main building covered an incomprehensible 3.5 million square feet, making it the largest factory under one roof in the world at the time. The assembly line itself was over a mile long, shaped like a giant L to fit within the property lines of the county. The logistical hurdles of getting Willow Run operational were staggering. Ford had to import tens of thousands of workers from across the country, many of them poor farmers from the deep south who had never seen an airplane, let alone used a pneumatic rivet gun. They had to build housing, schools, and infrastructure for a sudden population boom. Furthermore, Ford's engineers had to completely redraw Consolidated's blueprints. Aircraft engineers designed parts with loose tolerances, expecting mechanics to file and bend them to fit on the factory floor. Automotive engineers designed parts with absolute precision so that any part would perfectly fit any car on the line. Ford spent months translating the B-24 into automotive terms, creating massive steel stamping presses to punch out aluminium bulkheads in seconds, rather than having men cut them by hand. The aviation establishment mocked Ford, claiming you could not build a complex flying machine like a Model T. They called the plant Will It Run? But the joke was on them. When Willow Run finally hit its stride in 1944, the numbers it produced were absolutely terrifying to the Axis powers. At its peak, the mile-long assembly line was pushing out one fully complete, combat-ready B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. Let that sink in. Every hour, 24 hours a day, a massive heavy bomber rolled out the factory doors, was fueled up, test-flown, and immediately dispatched to the front lines. It was a relentless mechanical flood of aluminium and high explosives that German and Japanese industry could not even begin to comprehend, let alone match. The Germans were building highly complex, over-engineered weapons in small batches, relying on slave labor in underground caves. The Americans were building highly capable, standardized weapons of mass destruction on a scale that blotted out the sun. This industrial strategy is directly analogous to the production of the M4 Sherman tank or the Liberty ships. The United States did not win the Second World War by simply having better individual weapons. We won by standardizing good enough weapons and producing them in such overwhelming numbers that the enemy simply drowned in American steel. By the end of the war, a staggering 18,188 B-24 Liberators had been built across 5 different factories. It remains, to this day, the most produced heavy bomber in history, the most produced multi-engine aircraft in history, and the most produced American military aircraft of any type. Let us analyze the sheer scale of the force posture that this industrial miracle enabled. The Army Air Forces did not just deploy the B-24 in a few specialized squadrons. They built entire air armadas around it. In the European theatre, while the B-17 dominated the media coverage flying out of England with the mighty 8th Air Force, the B-24 was quietly making up a massive portion of the striking power. The 8th Air Force operated hundreds of Liberators, utilizing their higher speed to fly in separate bomber streams from the B-17 to avoid mid-air collisions. But it was in the Mediterranean theatre, operating with the 15th Air Force out of dusty airfields in southern Italy, that the B-24 truly became the primary weapon of strategic destruction in Europe. The 15th Air Force was heavily weighted with B-24 groups because their longer range was absolutely critical for reaching the heavily defended oil refineries in Ploesti, Romania, and the industrial complexes in southern Germany and Austria. The Liberator crews of the 15th flew some of the most grueling, high-casualty missions of the war, fighting their way through the worst weather in Europe, and the most experienced fighter pilots the Luftwaffe had left. Simultaneously, on the other side of the planet, the B-24 was the undisputed king of the Pacific. The 5th Air Force under General George Kenney, operating out of Australia and New Guinea, and the 13th Air Force in the South Pacific relied almost exclusively on the Liberator for heavy bombing duties. The B-17 was quickly phased out of the Pacific theater because it simply lacked the legs to cross the vast stretches of ocean required to hit Japanese strongholds like Rabaul or Balikpapan. In the Pacific, the B-24 was not just a strategic bomber, it was a maritime patrol aircraft, a low-level anti-shipping strike platform, and a vital supply transport. The Royal Air Force Coastal Command also eagerly adopted the B-24, using its massive range to close the Mid-Atlantic Gap, the area of the ocean where German U-boats had previously operated with impunity because Allied aircraft could not reach them. Equipped with radar and depth charges, very long-range Liberators became the ultimate U-boat killers, playing a decisive role in winning the Battle of the Atlantic. We have established the deep historical roots of the bomber mafia doctrine. We have dissected the brilliant, if unorthodox, aerodynamic engineering of the Davis wing, and we have witnessed the terrifying industrial might of the Willow Run assembly line that birthed this aluminium leviathan by the tens of thousands. The United States had successfully forged a weapon of unprecedented global reach, capable of carrying the fight to the enemy's doorstep, no matter where on Earth that doorstep was located. But blueprints, wind tunnels, and factory floors do not win wars on their own. The true measure of a combat aircraft is not taken in the sterile environment of a testing facility. It is measured in the freezing, oxygen-starved skies over hostile territory, where the theoretical physics of lift and drag collide violently with the brutal reality of flak shrapnel and 20mm cannon shells. To truly understand the legacy of the B-24 Liberator and to uncover exactly why its crews both loved and feared this flying boxcar, we must load the bomb bays, start the 4 massive twin Wasp engines, and send it directly into the teeth of the enemy's air defenses. Stepping through the incredibly narrow bomb bay doors of a fully loaded B-24 Liberator was like walking into the belly of a mechanical beast that actively wanted to kill you long before the enemy ever got a chance. The interior of the aircraft was completely devoid of any creature comforts. It was a flying aluminium tunnel, uninsulated, unpressurized, and deafeningly loud. The moment those 4 Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engines fired up, the vibration rattled right through the boots of the 10-man crew, shaking the thin metal skin of the fuselage. Once the aircraft climbed above 10,000 feet, the operational reality of high-altitude daylight precision bombing set in with brutal, freezing efficiency. Temperatures inside the waist gunner positions regularly plummeted to -40 or even -60 degrees Fahrenheit. The men wore thick, electrically heated fleece suits plugged into the aircraft's electrical system just to stave off frostbite, but the heating elements frequently shorted out, leaving gunners to freeze in the slipstream of the open waist windows. Oxygen masks were mandatory above 10,000 feet, and if a crewman's oxygen hose kinked or severed, he had roughly 3 minutes before hypoxia-induced unconsciousness, followed shortly by death. This was the harsh, unforgiving environment in which these young Americans, most of them barely out of high school, were expected to operate complex machinery and fight for their lives. To defend itself, the B-24 was heavily armed, bristling with 10.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. The Browning was an absolute masterpiece of American firepower, firing an 800-grain, armor-piercing incendiary slug at 2,900 feet per second. These guns were mounted in the tail, the nose, the upper fuselage, the waist windows, and the belly. The belly turret was a Sperry ball turret, a mechanized glass sphere that housed a single gunner curled into a fetal position, staring straight down at the earth. Unlike the B-17, where the ball turret was permanently fixed, the B-24's tricycle landing gear required the ball turret to be retractable. The gunner would physically crank the turret up into the fuselage before landing. Otherwise, a gear failure would result in the turret and the man inside it being ground into the runway concrete. While the armament was formidable, the tactical doctrine of the unescorted bomber formation was fundamentally flawed. The bomber mafia believed that a tight formation of heavy bombers, creating interlocking fields of fire, could fight their way through enemy fighter screens without the need for fighter escorts. This theory was written in blood over the skies of Europe. The B-24, for all its speed and range, was extremely exhausting to fly in these tight formations. The aircraft lacked any sort of hydraulic boost for the flight controls. The pilot and co-pilot had to physically muscle the heavy control yoke to keep the 30-ton bomber in a tight box formation, fighting the turbulent prop wash of the aircraft directly in front of them for hours on end. Flying a B-24 was less like piloting a modern aircraft and more like wrestling a Mack truck without power steering, while people are actively shooting at you. And when the shooting started, the brilliant aerodynamic engineering that made the Liberator so efficient suddenly became its greatest fatal flaw. The Davis wing, with its long, highly tapered and thin profile, was structurally fragile compared to the massive, over-engineered wing of the Boeing B-17. If a B-17 took a direct hit from an 88mm anti-aircraft shell, it could often lose massive chunks of its wing, have its structural spars shattered, and still somehow limp back to base in England. The B-17 was famous for absorbing catastrophic battle damage. The B-24 was a completely different story. If an 88mm shell detonated inside the Davis wing, the high-stress aerodynamic structure would simply fail. The wing would snap off completely, and the aircraft would immediately enter a violent, uncontrollable death spiral, pinning the crew to the bulkheads with centrifugal force and making it nearly impossible to bail out. Furthermore, the B-24's fuel system was a known hazard. The massive fuel tanks were located in the upper fuselage and the wings, and the fuel sight gauges were actually glass tubes located right on the flight deck. If a stray piece of flak or a 20mm cannon shell shattered those gauges, the cockpit would instantly flood with high-octane aviation gasoline, turning the aircraft into a flying bomb waiting for a single spark. Even surviving a mission and having to ditch in the ocean was a uniquely terrifying prospect for a Liberator crew. The roller-blind bomb bay doors that made it such a stable bombing platform were structurally weak against the impact of water. When a B-24 ditched in the sea, the water would violently crush the bomb bay doors, rushing into the cavernous fuselage and instantly snapping the aircraft's back, often taking the crew down to the bottom before they could deploy their life rafts. So why on earth would the military leadership send tens of thousands of American airmen into combat in an aircraft that snapped its wings, caught fire easily, and broke in half when it hit the water? The answer is cold, ruthless, strategic pragmatism. You do not win a global war of attrition by prioritizing a single crew's survivability over the strategic objective. You win by delivering the maximum amount of high explosives to the enemy's industrial base, at ranges the enemy believes to be impossible. This is the exact same logistical calculus that drove the adoption of the M4 Sherman tank over heavier, more heavily armored prototypes. The German Tiger tank could destroy 3 Shermans in a head-to-head fight, much like a B-17 could survive a beating that would obliterate a B-24. But the United States could build 10 Shermans for every Tiger and ship them across the ocean easily. More importantly, the Sherman had the operational mobility to exploit breakthroughs and destroy the German supply lines. The B-24 was the airborne Sherman. It traded the luxury of extreme battle-damage survivability for the absolute necessity of superior range, heavier payload, and overwhelming production numbers. When the strategic target was located deep behind enemy lines, far beyond the reach of the Flying Fortress, the Liberator was the only tool in the American arsenal capable of doing the job. Nowhere was this brutal reality more evident than on the morning of August 1st, 1943. The target was Ploesti, Romania. Ploesti was the heavily defended industrial heart of Adolf Hitler's war machine, a massive complex of oil refineries that supplied roughly 1/3 of all the high-octane aviation fuel for the Luftwaffe and the diesel for the panzer divisions on the Eastern Front. If you cut off the oil, the Nazi war machine grinds to a halt. But Ploesti was completely out of reach for bombers based in England. The only way to hit it was to launch from dusty, sand-swept airfields around Benghazi, Libya, fly completely across the Mediterranean Sea, cross the mountains of Albania and Yugoslavia, strike the target, and fly all the way back. It was a staggering 2,400-mile round trip. The B-17 could not even dream of making that flight with a meaningful bomb load. Only the B-24 Liberator had the legs for the job. The United States Army Air Forces assembled a massive strike force of 177 B-24s, drawn from 5 different bomb groups, including the 98th, the 44th, and the 93rd. The plan, conceived by Colonel Jacob Smart, was audacious, bordering on suicidal. Instead of bombing from 25,000 feet, where the German radar would track them for hours and the anti-aircraft flak would be waiting, the entire armada would fly at treetop level. They would cross the Mediterranean right on the deck, pop up over the mountains, and drop back down into the Romanian valleys, approaching the refineries at an altitude of 50 to 100 feet. The idea was to achieve total tactical surprise, flying under the German radar and dropping delayed fuse bombs directly into the boiler houses and cracking plants. Commanding the operation were hard-bitten veterans like Colonel John Killer Kane and Colonel Leon Johnson. But military plans rarely survive first contact with the enemy, or in this case, first contact with bad weather and human error. As the massive formation crossed the mountains of the Balkans, heavy clouds broke the groups apart. Radio silence was strictly enforced, meaning the separated formations could not coordinate to reform. The fatal mistake occurred at the final navigational waypoint. The lead elements, guided by Colonel K.K. Compton and General Uzal Ent, mistook the town of Targoviste for the correct turn point of Ploesti. They turned south too early, heading directly for the heavily defended city of Bucharest instead of the refineries at Ploesti. By the time they realized their error and turned back toward the target, the element of surprise was completely gone. The German Air Defense Commander, General Alfred Gerstenberg, had spent years turning Ploesti into one of the most heavily defended targets on the planet. He had ringed the refineries with hundreds of 88mm, 37mm, and 20mm anti-aircraft guns, many of them hidden in haystacks, fake barns, and even mounted on specialized Q-trains that rolled along the railroad tracks parallel to the bomber approach routes. When the B-24s finally roared into the target area, they were met by a solid wall of lead and fire. Because the formations were scattered, they attacked from different directions at different times. The trailing groups had to fly directly into the massive explosions and towering columns of black, oily smoke created by the first wave. Bombers were flying so low that they were actually taking small arms fire from Romanian farmers in the cornfields. The combat was intimate, chaotic, and unimaginably violent. B-24s were skimming the smokestacks, their bellies scraping the rooftops of the refineries. Anti-aircraft gunners were firing down at the bombers from elevated flak towers. When a Liberator took a fatal hit at 50 feet, there was no time to bail out. The aircraft simply turned into a massive fireball and cartwheeled into the refinery tanks, adding to the apocalyptic destruction. Colonel Kane and Colonel Johnson led their groups directly into the inferno of the Astra Romana and Columbia Aquila refineries, flying through sheets of solid flame, their aircraft absorbing hundreds of hits from light anti-aircraft fire. Bombs with delayed fuses were literally bouncing off the pavement and skipping into the buildings. The sky was filled with the terrifying sight of B-24s missing wings, engines on fire, desperately trying to pull up before crashing into the industrial hellscape. When the smoke finally cleared and the surviving aircraft limped back toward North Africa, the butcher's bill was staggering. Of the 177 B-24s that launched, 53 were lost. Over 300 American airmen were killed or missing, and hundreds more were captured. 5 medals of honor were awarded for that single mission, 3 of them posthumously, marking it as one of the most highly decorated and bloodiest single engagements in the history of American air power. When you look at those numbers, when you lose nearly a third of your elite strike force in a single afternoon, and the enemy manages to restore the majority of their oil production within a few months, do you call that a strategic masterstroke or a tactical suicide mission? The brass in Washington hailed it as a heroic demonstration of American reach, but the men who survived the fire of Ploesti knew it for what it was: a meat grinder that exposed the extreme vulnerability of heavy bombers operating at low altitudes against prepared defenses, while the skies over Europe were filled with the dramatic high-altitude clashes between the 8th Air Force and the Luftwaffe. The B-24 was fighting a completely different but equally savage war on the other side of the planet. In the Pacific Theater, the tyranny of distance dictated every single strategic decision. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, faced a theater of operations consisting of thousands of miles of open ocean and dense, impenetrable jungles. His primary targets were Japanese shipping, isolated island fortresses, and sprawling logistical hubs. Kenney quickly realized that high-altitude precision bombing in the Pacific was largely a myth. The weather was atrocious, and dropping bombs from 20,000 feet onto a zigzagging Japanese destroyer was a waste of ammunition. Kenney needed a heavy bomber that could fly immense distances, carry a massive payload, and get down into the weeds to kill ships. He found his perfect weapon in the B-24 Liberator, and he found his mad scientist in a man named Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn. Gunn was a legendary innovator who looked at the factory-standard B-24 and decided it lacked forward firepower. He ruthlessly stripped out the complex, highly classified Norden bomb sight and the glass nose of several Liberators, replacing them with solid metal noses packed with 4 to 6 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. He turned the strategic bomber into a heavy strafing platform. Kenney's crews developed a tactic called skip bombing, Instead of dropping bombs from high altitude, a B-24 would approach a Japanese transport ship at mast height, flying at 250 miles per hour, just 50 feet above the waves. The pilot would unleash a devastating barrage from his forward-firing .50 calibers, sweeping the decks of the enemy ship clear of anti-aircraft gunners. Then, at the last possible second, he would release bombs equipped with delayed fuses. The bombs would literally skip across the surface of the water like flat stones, slamming directly into the side of the Japanese ship and detonating below the waterline, breaking the vessel's back. This tactic was incredibly dangerous, requiring nerves of absolute steel. But it was devastatingly effective, effectively strangling the Japanese supply lines throughout the Southwest Pacific. The absolute peak of the B-24's operational endurance in the Pacific was demonstrated during the strikes on the oil refineries at Balikpapan, Borneo, in the fall of 1944. Much like Ploesti, Balikpapan was a critical source of aviation fuel for the Japanese military. And much like Ploesti, it was located at the extreme edge of operational range. To hit Balikpapan, B-24 crews of the 5th and 13th Air Forces had to fly from bases in New Guinea and the Schouten Islands. This was a 2,600-mile round trip. It required the crews to be in the air for up to 16 grueling hours. Just surviving the environment for 16 hours in an unpressurized, vibrating metal tube was a test of human endurance. The Pacific weather fronts were legendary killers. Equatorial thunderstorms built massive cumulonimbus clouds that reached 40,000 feet into the sky, hiding violent updrafts and downdrafts that could literally tear the wings off an airplane. Flying a heavily loaded B-24 through these tropical fronts, battling severe icing on the wings and blinding torrential rain, all while navigating over featureless ocean, required supreme airmanship. This operational reality is highly reminiscent of the B-52 arc light strikes during the Vietnam War, where bomber crews flew exhausting multi-hour missions from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam to strike targets in Southeast Asia. In both conflicts, the sheer physical toll of the transit was a battle in itself, long before the aircraft ever entered the lethal envelope of enemy air defenses. When the Liberators finally reached Balikpapan, they were met by aggressive swarms of Japanese Zero fighters and heavy anti-aircraft fire. Because of the extreme range, the B-24s initially had no fighter escort, forcing them to rely entirely on their own interlocking fields of fire. The sky over Borneo became a swirling, chaotic dogfight, with heavy bombers desperately trying to hold formation while fending off head-on passes from Japanese fighters. The Balikpapan raids successfully crippled the Japanese oil supply, but they cost the Liberator crews dearly in blood and machinery. The B-24 proved that it could project American power across the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Pacific, doing the dirty, unglamorous, and exhausting work of dismantling an empire, island by island, ship by ship, and refinery by refinery. But surviving the flak towers of Romania or the tropical typhoons of the South Pacific was only part of the Liberator's brutal equation. To truly grasp the total war impact of this forgotten behemoth, we have to look at the psychological toll it extracted from the boys who manned its frozen guns, and the unforgiving calculus of the post-war chopping block that erased it from history. The psychological toll of climbing into an aircraft that you knew was structurally unforgiving, highly flammable, and incredibly difficult to fly was a burden that the crews of the B-24 Liberator carried on every single mission. When a young American aviator arrived at a replacement depot in England or Italy, he often prayed to be assigned to a B-17 group, having heard the legendary tales of flying fortresses limping home with half their tails missing. When he was instead handed orders for a B-24 squadron, a quiet dread often set in, because the brutal reality of the Liberator's glass jaw was an open secret among the men who flew it. This brings us to one of the most critical tactical lessons of the strategic bombing campaign, a lesson paid for with the lives of tens of thousands of American airmen. The pre-war bomber mafia doctrine, which stated that heavily armed bombers could defend themselves without fighter escort, was a catastrophic failure of military theory. This doctrinal stubbornness is eerily reminiscent of the frontal infantry assaults ordered by Union generals during the American Civil War at places like Cold Harbor or Fredericksburg. In both cases, military leadership believed that sheer mass and concentrated firepower could overwhelm entrenched defenses, completely underestimating the lethality of the enemy's defensive technology. Just as the rifled muskets slaughtered massed infantry formations, the radar-directed anti-aircraft gun and the heavily armed interceptor slaughtered unescorted bomber streams. The B-24, despite its 10 heavy machine guns, was a sitting duck for a Luftwaffe pilot flying a Focke-Wulf 190 armed with 20mm cannons. The German pilots quickly learned that a head-on attack against a B-24 was highly effective, as the early models lacked a powered nose turret, and a few well-placed cannon shells in the thin Davis wing would send the 30-ton bomber tumbling out of the sky. It was not until the introduction of the P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter capable of escorting the bombers all the way to Berlin and back, that the casualty rates finally began to stabilize. But even with fighter cover, the B-24 crews lived in a constant state of high anxiety, knowing their aircraft simply could not absorb the punishment that its Boeing counterpart could. Yet, when we shift our perspective from the tactical survival of a single crew to the grand strategic calculus of a global war, the B-24's design compromises become brilliantly justified. The strategic value of the Liberator was not in its armor, but in its unparalleled utility and its massive logistical footprint. Consider the Battle of the Atlantic, arguably the most critical and longest-running campaign of the Second World War. If the supply lines between the United States and Great Britain were severed by German U-boats, the invasion of Europe would be impossible, and England would starve. In 1942, German Admiral Karl Dönnitz's Wolfpacks were sinking Allied shipping at an unsustainable rate, operating freely in a vast area of the ocean known as the Mid-Atlantic Gap, or the Black Pit. This was a stretch of water perfectly out of range for land-based aircraft operating from North America, Iceland, or Britain. The B-17 simply did not have the fuel capacity to loiter in this zone. Enter the Very Long Range, or VLR, B-24 Liberator. By stripping out unnecessary armor, removing the heavy ball turret, and installing massive auxiliary fuel tanks in the bomb bay, Allied engineers created a maritime patrol aircraft that could stay airborne for up to 18 hours. These VLR Liberators, operated primarily by British Coastal Command and the US Navy, were equipped with highly classified ASV Mark II radar and a massive, millions of candle power searchlight called a Lee light. How do you hunt a steel tube operating in millions of square miles of pitch-black ocean? You combine signals intelligence from the ultra codebreakers at Bletchley Park, who decrypted the U-boat radio transmissions, with the immense physical reach of the B-24. The Liberators would fly out into the Mid-Atlantic Gap, use their radar to detect a surfaced U-boat charging its batteries in the dead of night, dive down to 50 feet off the deck, and illuminate the submarine with the blinding Lee light just seconds before dropping a string of depth charges. The introduction of the VLR Liberator slammed the Mid-Atlantic Gap shut, denying the U-boats their safe haven and effectively breaking the back of the German submarine offensive. This strategic victory was entirely dependent on the aerodynamic efficiency of the Davis wing and the massive fuel capacity of the B-24's slab-sided fuselage. It is a perfect historical parallel to the modern deployment of long-range maritime patrol drones like the MQ-4C Triton, prioritizing endurance and sensor payload over kinetic survivability to dominate massive expanses of ocean. The logistical requirements to keep 18,000 B-24 Liberators operational across 4 distinct combat theaters stagger the imagination. We are not just talking about manufacturing the aircraft at Willow Run. We are talking about the economic and industrial miracle required to feed these mechanical beasts. A single B-24 consumed roughly 200 gallons of 100-octane aviation fuel every single hour it was in the air. When the 15th Air Force launched a strike package of 500 Liberators from Italy to bomb Austria, that single mission required over 1 million gallons of highly refined fuel, not to mention the thousands of tons of bombs, the millions of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, and the spare Pratt & Whitney engines that had to be shipped across the Atlantic Ocean. The United States essentially built a global floating pipeline of Liberty ships and oil tankers just to keep the bomber fleets flying. Furthermore, the B-24's massive payload capacity led to its adaptation into one of the most vital logistical tools of the war, the C-87 Liberator Express. Because it was essentially a flying boxcar, the military stripped out the guns and the bomb racks, installed a cargo floor, and used it to haul critical supplies. When the Japanese cut off the Burma Road, strangling the supply lines to the Chinese army, it was fleets of C-87s and modified B-24s that flew the hump. This was a terrifying, high-altitude airlift operation over the jagged peaks of the Himalayas, flying through some of the most violent weather on Earth to deliver fuel, ammunition, and food to China. The B-17 could not carry enough cargo high enough to clear the mountains, making the Liberator the absolute lifeline of the China-Burma-India theater. The ability of the American military-industrial complex to take a strategic bomber and seamlessly convert it into a heavy theater transport is a testament to the brutal, utilitarian flexibility of the design. So, if the B-24 flew more missions, dropped more bombs, sank more submarines, hauled more cargo, and was produced in vastly greater numbers than the B-17, we are left with a massive historical contradiction. Why did the American public fall in love with the Flying Fortress, while the Liberator was relegated to the dusty back rooms of military aviation history? The answer lies in the multidimensional warfare of politics, public relations, and geography. Boeing, the manufacturer of the B-17, possessed a highly sophisticated and aggressive public relations department. They actively courted the press, branding their aircraft with the incredibly evocative name Flying Fortress, which projected an image of rugged, impenetrable American strength. Consolidated Aircraft, on the other hand, was an engineering-focused company that completely neglected the PR war. More importantly, geography dictated the media narrative. The mighty 8th Air Force, operating the B-17, was based in England. London was the media capital of the free world, crawling with famous American journalists like Edward R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite. It was incredibly easy for a reporter to take a train to an 8th Air Force base, interview a handsome young bomber crew, snap photos of a battle-damaged B-17 that had miraculously survived, and wire the story back to the New York Times in time for the Sunday edition. The B-17 was accessible, it was photogenic, and its stories of survival were perfect for boosting home front morale. The B-24, conversely, was fighting in the forgotten corners of the earth. They were flying out of the malaria-infested jungles of New Guinea, the scorching deserts of North Africa, and the remote, dusty airfields of southern Italy. There were no high-profile journalists embedded with the 5th Air Force in the Pacific. Furthermore, the War Department itself played favorites. When the military wanted to make a propaganda film to sell war bonds, they chose a B-17 crew, resulting in the famous 1944 documentary, The Memphis Belle. The B-24 was the blue-collar worker doing the dirty, exhausting, unglamorous jobs in the worst conditions imaginable, while the B-17 got the Hollywood treatment. This PR disparity cemented the B-17 in the American cultural consciousness, proving that in warfare, the weapon that wins the propaganda battle often eclipses the weapon that actually did the heaviest lifting. The ultimate fate of the B-24 Liberator is perhaps the most ruthless example of military pragmatism in American history. When the Japanese surrendered in September of 1945, the United States possessed an armada of thousands of combat-ready liberators. But the technology of aerial warfare had advanced at a terrifying pace. The introduction of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, with its pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, and massive payload, rendered the unpressurized, physically exhausting B-24 instantly obsolete. The military had no use for them, and the civilian market certainly had no use for 4-engine gas guzzlers. The solution was an industrial execution on a scale never before seen. Thousands of surviving B-24s, many of them brand-new aircraft that had rolled off the Willow Run assembly line just months prior, were flown to massive aircraft boneyards in the American Southwest, most notably Kingman Army Airfield in Arizona. There, a private contractor bought the aircraft for pennies on the dollar. The mighty bombers, which had survived flak over Ploesti and typhoons over the Pacific, were lined up in the desert sun and systematically destroyed. A massive steel blade, dropped from a crane, chopped the fuselages in half. The aluminum carcasses were thrown into massive smelting furnaces, melting down the pride of the American war machine into generic aluminum ingots, which were then sold off to make pots, pans, and siding for the post-war housing boom. Within just 3 years of the war ending, the vast majority of the 18,000 liberators had been completely wiped from the face of the earth. This rapid, unsentimental disposal of a massive military asset mirrors the immediate post-Cold War drawdown, where highly capable ships and aircraft were instantly scrapped the moment the strategic threat evaporated. The military does not keep weapons for sentimental reasons. They are tools, and when a tool is no longer the most efficient means of destruction, it is discarded without hesitation. The story of the Consolidated B-24 Liberator is not a tale of sleek, glamorous aviation romance. It is a cold, hard lesson in the brutal mathematics of total war. It was an aircraft designed by a gamble, built by an automotive industrial miracle, and flown by teenagers into the most lethal environments ever created by man. It was physically demanding, structurally unforgiving, and completely devoid of comfort. But it possessed the two metrics that actually mattered in a global war of attrition: massive range and overwhelming numbers. The Liberator drowned the Axis powers in high explosives, strangled their supply lines across vast oceans, and stretched the American industrial fist to the farthest corners of the globe. It was the ultimate blue-collar brawler, the ugly duckling that did the heavy lifting, while others took the credit. In the grand theatre of military history, the B-24 stands as a monument to function over form, a testament to the terrifying efficiency of American mass production, and a solemn tribute to the tens of thousands of young men who froze fought, and died in its cavernous aluminum belly. The true measure of a weapon is not found in Hollywood movies, but in the ashes of the enemy's industrial capacity. And by that metric, the flying boxcar was one of the most devastatingly effective weapons ever forged. Now, I want to hear from you down in the comments. Based on our deep dive today, what do you think was the single most important factor that led to the B-24 being overshadowed by the B-17 in the history books? A. The B-24's lack of structural survivability and high casualty rates made it unpopular with crews. B. Boeing's superior public relations machine and the media's focus on the England-based 8th Air Force. C. The B-24's ugly utilitarian design simply did not capture the public's imagination like the sleek Flying Fortress. Let me know your choice and your reasoning below, and make sure you are subscribed for more uncompromising military analysis.